In the early 1900s, women's suffrage was stuck in a rut. The issue as a whole was viewed as something that was only important to white-collar white women in our country. That was until Alice Paul came into play in 1912. Her goal was to win the right for women's voting, equal voting in the United States. She thought that the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the group that she was a part of, wasn't doing enough, and it was not being aggressive enough on its stance of gender equality and voting rights in the United States at the time. With her experience in England, she came back to the United States and was asked to head a committee in Washington, D.C. And then, over bad press and bad publicity, as the party saw it, she was eventually kicked out. But for 8 years of hard work and dedication, she was successful in winning the Equal Rights Amendment, which was voted in 1920, that actually finally won women the right to vote in the United States. But to understand the success, you need to understand 3 points that all tie together that was the women's suffrage movement at the time. How they beat their decline, their slow decline that was occurring at the time, how they recruited, and ultimately their tactics of how they approach problems at a grassroots level, and how they protested in Washington, D.C. at the time, and also spread their message across the country to also gain support. Moving into how they beat the slow decline of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or just the suffrage movement as a whole, which wasn't really successful, nor did they have a good orator or speaker since Susan B. Anthony, who had passed away some time before. In page 349 in the Reader, it's understood that some organizations will become comfortable. They may even try to think that their message is mainstream. That is why they do not protest nor march in the streets, or really get their message out there in other means of media, or use their social networks. They start to decline, and sit back. Alice Paul at the time thought that this was a loss for them. They need to be aggressive, or else they would be swept away and lost. Because at the same time, Wilson had just become president, and he saw women's rights as an issue that wasn't that important. He thought that his view is across the sea in Europe with World War I that was just now starting. So, to understand the recruitment overall, you need to understand framing and how Alice Paul saw women's rights not only as just, like I said earlier, a woman's issue, like an older, affluent woman or anything like that. She thought it was all women's problem and all women's issue. So she brought together labor and civil rights at the same time. She wanted blacks to be a part of her movement, black women. She wanted women working in factories and immigrants who were also at the same time known for organizing labor to be a part of it. And that is how she framed it, or framing war, which is frames are simplified devices that help us understand, organize the complexities of the world. Page 55, Goodwin. And so Alice Paul wanted women's suffrage to be framed and seen in a way that was everyone's problem. That was her goal. It was because if women were Americans, all Americans should care, or all American women should care. And so moving on then to their tactics and ultimately how they all tied these things together through their actions. In 1913, the procession occurred, which was a march in a parade in Washington, D.C. at the time. Alice Paul had organized it and had women of all groups in their uniforms all there with their banners marching. The problem is that it incited a riot. But the good news behind this was that it actually put the women's rights issue in an interesting spot. They were being attacked. They needed to be defended in America. And with that happening, the party and women's suffrage as an issue was now defended in the media in the United States. This was a big jump for them at the time. And it also needs to be understand how they were acting at the time was also in order to attract and retain participants to pursue a movement's agenda. Activists continually move to mobilize affective states and emotions that mesh with the movement's political objectives and tactics, while suppressing those that do the opposite. Meaning at the time was the federal government and politicians who saw opposite from them. I apologize, that was on page 254, also in the Reader. After continually spreading her message and her aggressive stance, Paul began to have a different viewpoint of how she needed to act that from the party that she came from, the NAWSA. They kicked her out, actually, and she had to generate and create her own party, which was the National Women's Party in 1916. At the same time, World War I had begun, and women's suffrage again was being put on the wayside whenever now America was now going to war. This is when they began the Silent Sentinels protest, when women would stand out, part of the NWP would stand outside of the White House and in protest and hold Wilson quotes against him. Eventually, another riot was incited, and the women out there were actually imprisoned, where they stayed there for almost a year. Alice Paul was one of the women who were also imprisoned. It needs to be understood that while she was in prison, she began a hunger strike. In the hunger strike, she was trying to generate guilt against the administration so that they would let her go, because she saw that she was wrongfully imprisoned. So they began to force feed her. The news of this broke out, and so what occurred then was that when the news then saw that women suffragists were being force-fed and somewhat tortured inside these prisons, again, the media and the American public were on their side. After that, a court case in the National Women's Party was successful, and they were freed. And from there, they kept pushing their role for another 3 years, and eventually they were successful. Thank you.